Thank you so much, Robert. Nice to have you here. I'm gonna start with the first question. And you've done such important work on topics like empire and race. What first sparked your interest in those areas of study?
Yeah. Well, my route to these subjects is quite bookish, and it does reflect my past studies, I must admit. It does reflect the benefits of a university education. I studied English literature as an undergraduate and then as a postgraduate, but as it was an undergraduate really where I was introduced to thinking about topics such as empire and race and being introduced to really excellent scholars at Nottingham Trent University, who there was a real specialism there in sort of post-colonial studies and that kind of work. So I was kind of kindly brought into the fold by those scholars and encouraged to think about English literature in a really quite critical way, and in terms of the ways in which English literature has been implicated in violence and in cultural forms of violence, which has always sort of fascinated me. And in particular, my uh, my route to the subjects which I've specialised in was through reading a text which these days is pretty notorious, a controversial text which isn't actually taught very much anymore, but it's Joseph Conrad's short novel Heart of Darkness. Very famous, as I say, but equally controversial these days, and used to be regarded as one of the most studied texts in the English language, but I doubt it is these days in truth. Um, and a curiosity with that text and a fascination with it, but at the same time, a deep sort of um, anxiety about what it was saying and a sort of, repulsion about what it was saying at the same time. And a sense that really this just can't be the last word on Central Africa and colonialism in Central Africa, which I think it was sort of often positioned as, certainly back then, and as being sort of, the thing you needed to read. So a deep dissatisfaction with that idea, and a lot of my work subsequent to that really has been about trying to recover different stories, particularly, as I say, from the past of Central Africa, um, stories of the Central African past, which uh, could show European colonialism in a more complex light, but equally one in which would recover a sense of um, African history and in particular African agency from that context, which of course Conrad um, doesn't do, isn't interested in, and cannot, seems unable to represent. So like I say, it's really a very studious path to this subject. It comes through my own educational upbringing, particularly at university, and an encounter with Conrad's novel, which has led me to basically write, quite a lot of stuff on the back of. And I think my entire publishing career in truth is a series of footnotes and responses to Heart of Darkness.
Oh, that's amazing. And it kind of answers the next question as well. It like leaps into it beautifully. Like, how do you view your role as a historian in shaping how people understand these historical events, like so complex?
Yeah, okay. So the role of the historian who grapples with these subjects of empire and race is difficult because I think two different things and they kind of contrast one another somewhat. On the one hand, I think we all need to get to grips with this past because it is everybody's history. There is no separating yourself out and saying, well, that's something that happened, to a different country, or to different people. The history of race, of empire is everybody's story. But at the same time, I'm also really conscious that there are important senses in which this isn't sort of my history, perhaps personally, or at least um, there are certain forms of privilege which come from me being positioned as somebody who gets to narrate and tell these histories. And that's obviously something which a feeling within me which has grown over the time of my career, but I suppose particularly through the late 2010s and early 2020s with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and that increasing question about, uh, the white curriculum and about the sort of the colonial uh, histories and legacies of a university education. So it's that sense on the one hand that we all ought to be thinking about this, and then on the other hand, a sense that it it perhaps is important for me to ensure that perspectives other than mine are given space and given oxygen. So my answer to that in terms of my own research, um, in terms of the publications which I produced, has really tried to recover forgotten perspectives on empire and race from the past. Um, Perspectives which perhaps are unusual outside of what we think we know about the colonial past, and which might otherwise be quite inaccessible for students and other readers, and to share those historical perspectives, I suppose, in the end, to try to encourage a broadening out and diversification of present perspectives on the past, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yes, and you so beautifully done in your book of on Colwyn Bay, which is part of what we research for this project. So during our research stage. So yeah, that's gonna be my next question. If we can start by discussing the African Institute of Colwyn Bay, like what's the current discourse on the subject, and if it's viewed in an accurate light?
Well, thank you for those comments. So the African Institute of Colwyn Bay is a curious little story, isn't it? I mean, it's a micro history in truth. You know, ultimately a quite small number of young African people who were brought in very different circumstances to a smallish town, and particularly small back then in North Wales, over a fairly short period of time, but engaged in I think quite an interesting and momentous experiment, really, in intercultural relations, in a form of imperialism, and in what in the 19th century was often referred to as the kind of civilizing mission. Um, I don't know if it's a well-known story even today, but of course, perspectives on it are broadening out, thanks in part to your project and to other recent initiatives to engage Welsh audiences first and foremost in the history of the African Institute. And I think all of that is really positive. So it's becoming more well known. As to how accurate I think our knowledge of that past is, I think there's some really good reference points out there, some good studies, and I think what's really important, less than questions of simple accuracy, what's really important is, who gets to take part in this history, who gets to have a say and to reflect on it in terms of its relevance to their lives today. And so, I really welcome the fact that your project is bringing this history to schools, for instance, because perhaps what matters even more than questions of historical detail and accuracy are how we interpret this past in our own present. My feeling about accuracy is that there are a couple of things probably which in my book I tried um, to change the narrative somewhat in regard of. And the first thing was William Hughes, the schoolmaster, a former missionary who brings a couple of children and also with it the idea back to Wales to raise up this school and create a school in Colwyn Bay. There are all kinds of good reasons to see Hughes as a quite sympathetic character, and I can understand all of that. I think what's probably more beneficial is to plug Hughes into the historical context that makes sense of him, and to understand him as a figure, perhaps sort of quite inadvertently and almost accidentally caught up in, like I say, an imperial project. Rather than sort of treating him purely as a sort of heroic figure, as I think has been the case in some of the earlier studies from a few decades back. Let's put this guy in his historical context and see him, caught up in world events, really, which he is slightly. He's trying to get in touch with Leopold II and to get his patronage, even after some knowledge of the really awful things that Leopold is involved in the Congo are coming to light. So let's understand him in his moment and really understand him as in that sort of true three-dimensional complexity that he warrants, rather than seeing him as, you know, a simple good guy or a white savior or a hero or something like that. And the other part of the story, which I've tried to refine and which my book tries to put most emphasis on, is regarding the students themselves. And I think that previously the students have been seen in rather lumping terms, you know, as a bunch of Africans, basically. And what was needed from my point of view was to sort of disentangle the various stories that kind of unite, but also separate out the 90-ish young people who were enrolled at that school. So to understand them in terms of their diversity was really important in my book. And, you know, there is an incredible difference between the very young Central African children who first are brought with Hughes, for instance, to some of the really quite well-educated, effectively middle class, you know, university-bound West Africans who are arriving in the school in their late teens or early 20s at the end. You know, to just sort of see them all as one big group made no sense to me. So thinking about uh, the African Institute as a kind of way of understanding the complexity and diversity of African experience in Victorian Britain was the thing that I really tried to bring, I suppose, to the fore in my book.
Thank you so much, Robert. And could you, those were very interesting aspects. Could you share maybe some examples of stories that are not necessarily acknowledged about the Colwyn Bay African Institute? And yeah, why do you think maybe those stories are overlooked?
Yeah, okay. So it's one of the challenges of writing the book and of getting down to the individual student stories was this. Some of the students are fairly well known, actually. They came to Britain fairly well equipped to get on in life, you know, better educated than Hughes in many instances. He had a fairly modest education. Um, and they used Colwyn Bay briefly as a kind of launch pad onto university careers and would then travel on often. Some stayed in Britain, but some would go back to Africa or venture onto the United States or whatever and have quite successful lives. And it's relatively easy to recover those stories. And those stories were already fairly well known, I think, before I'd done my research. I've maybe added a few, you know, details and colors to those stories. Um, but they're relatively well known. One of the things I think it's really interesting to think about with Colwyn Bay and the students that attended there are those cases of lesser success or indeed non-success. You know, there were about 90 students, as I say, that passed through the school. We tend to talk or focus, you know, our memory of the school on about 10 of them. What about all of those others? Why do we remember those less well? What stories do they have to tell, or what stories didn't they have to tell, I suppose? And what were the sort of criteria for success, or as I'm calling it, non-success? Was it that they simply didn't speak English so well? Or was it that they sort of, you know, maybe thought, this isn't for me. I'm not actually too into what's happening here. Maybe they quietly and politely resisted the premise of the African Institute and spent a bit of time before traveling back home. So those stories which are harder to get hold of are increasingly of interest to me, in fact. This is partly a gendered history, of course. You're more likely to be regarded in late Victorian and Edwardian Britain as a success if you conform to the very gendered criteria for success in that period. So the three young girls and women who go to the school, their stories are a little bit harder to recover, and their lights burn a little bit less brightly in Hughes's eyes, at least, but those are important stories to recover. But as I say, it's often about those stories of the students who just kind of came and went and perhaps didn't seem to do too much. And I think I'd love to push for a better understanding of those stories. But that's really challenging from a historical perspective because, of course, the archive records success, or indeed it records extreme failure. So you're more likely to be in the archive if you've done something incredible and there's a record of that, you've made it into the newspapers, or if you've done something really bad, of course, then you make it into the newspapers for different reasons. And those more in between experiences in all forms of history are more likely to just be lost. So recovering some of those lesser known stories is, I think, a really interesting way forward for historical research of the African Institute. But it's a problem, also an interesting problem of historical research as to how to do that.
Yeah, 100%. We agree with that. And now I'm going to move into Wales' broader involvement in colonialism.
Before we go on, is it
Yeah.
okay, Robert? After hearing you speak, Rob, I really had this question in my mind about why you think the devolved nation's involvement with empire isn't as well known.
Yeah, that's right. It feels as if perhaps it's a bit more underrepresented, a bit less well understood. I think there's been, that said, an awful lot of work in recent years in Scotland in sort of in terms of understanding its past and its connections to slavery as well as to empire. And I do think also in Wales there's probably been there has been really good inroads made in recent years. I equally would want to just sort of pause and think, how effective has England been really in recovering its colonial past? It would seem to me that in England and then sort of scaling that up in terms of British discussion and debate, that there is, it's very hard these days to have a sensible debate on the imperial past without, the kind of culture wars backlash happening. And I think, if anything, there's probably been a little bit, this is my perspective, as an English person looking out from across to Scotland and Wales, that there probably has been a bit more headspace for reasoned, intelligent debate in those countries than in England in recent times. So yeah, I'm kind of complicating the question a bit there, I guess. Hannah, good question though it is. But each of the nations are on a bit of a journey, aren't they, to a better understanding of their past. But that really is the work of history, isn't it? And we'll never come to a sort of full, accurate, comprehensive, or acceptable understanding of that past. The work of history is always to keep refining and keep questioning what we're doing, rather than imagining that we really understand the past truly.
Thank you. That's an amazing answer. Moving on to the next question, Robert. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. No, it's good. Thank you. That was amazing. Yeah, moving on to Wales' border involvement in colonialism. How do you think Wales' rhetoric around colonialism has evolved? Especially, I'm interested maybe in the last decade or so. Are there aspects of its involvement that are still unrepresented or misunderstood?
Yeah, as I was saying in my answer to the previous question, I think inevitably there will be aspects which are underrepresented, misunderstood, and the more that we recover in a weird way, the more that will be the case, right? Because as we discover more and more about the past, we'll realize more and more about other aspects of the past that we don't know so well. And as you then recover, certain aspects of the past, others will fall out of view and become therefore more in need of returning to and thinking again as our understanding shifts. So we will continue to kind of learn more and more about how little we know about the imperial past in Wales and elsewhere as we dig deeper and sort of learn more at the same time. I think that's just the nature of the discipline. All of that said, like I said before, I think there have been really good inroads made in the last few decades. My sense, and again, it's sort of looking from afar somewhat, is that an awful lot of the work in recent decades has been community-led, has been led through researcher activists. Also, I think through sort of like libraries and archives and those kind of institutes. I think there is a danger that when it comes to sort of mainstream historical research, and I suppose I mean in higher education, there is a danger of the subject being continuing to be sidelined and somewhat underfunded. So bringing together the really good work that's been happening through communities, arts projects, libraries, and so on, with universities, I think is the continuing task and is really imperative.
Thank you. The next question is about Henry Morton Stanley. And as we know of your practice as well, you are specialized in Belgium involvement in Congo and Leopold II, and that connection to Henry Morton Stanley as well for our project is interesting. And yeah. Obviously, he's recognized as a central figure in Welsh colonialism. What are your thoughts on his legacy and how we should view him in the context of Welsh history?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Having just spoken about the culture wars, we're not going to talk about Stanley, are we? Okay, great. So, yeah, so look, I mean, I think I've got a simple answer and then a more qualified and complicated answer. And the simple one is, his legacy, as far as I'm concerned, is that he took Leopold's money to initiate a murderous regime of empire. And I think that's probably his main legacy. But I think there's definite value at the same time in continuing an intelligent debate on Stanley and his legacy. Of course, what I've just said is not very nuanced and is just a sort of headline take. He is interesting in terms of his Welsh identity, among other things, which is itself quite complicated. And it's just one of the various aspects of Stanley's identity, which, biographers have found an awful lot of complexity lying within. So where reasoned debate is possible around Stanley, I think it's worthwhile because it can just bring home to us some of the complex psychological, psychosocial, and other elements of the drive to conquer and to colonize. He's certainly no hero, but I think at the same time, there's very little value in using him simply as a punch bag, as a well-known figure from the Welsh imperial past. It's better to perhaps for the debate to move on to reach for understanding him in all his complexity. I think also just to say, a lot of the debate is about Stanley himself. I wonder how much these days anybody ever reads what Stanley actually wrote. It's understandable in a way because, life is short and there's a lot of things that we might spend our time reading, and Stanley's sort of, 500 to 800 page travelogues are not necessarily top of everybody's reading list. I can think of other things I would encourage people to read about Central Africa way ahead of reading Stanley. But if we are going to have the debate on Stanley and to continue to research and analyze him, then it might be also sensible for us to continue to spend time with his travelogues. They're reprehensible in many ways, of course, and they've been well studied in terms of the ways in which, they sort of denigrate and other African peoples and cultures. All of that's pretty well known. But as scholars such as Brian Murray have identified, there is also some really interesting things happening in Stanley's travelogues, and they themselves are well worthy of our scrutiny. So continuing to think about the man, but also, I suppose I'm saying the writing as well, is something that we should do if we are going to continue to have a reasoned debate on this figure.
Thank you so much, Robert. And now a question about more of a Welsh public perception of colonialism, I guess, and the empire. Yeah, when discussing Welsh role in the empire, do you think there's a gap between historical knowledge and public perception?
So this is so you kindly shared the questions with me in advance, and this is the one where I kind of thought, oh, I don't know about this question, if I'm honest.
Of course.
Here's my reasons. I'm not Welsh.
Yes, no,
I'm
yeah.
not. I don't live in Wales. I'm not part of the Welsh public in that sort of sense. I don't know if I really know Welsh public perception well enough to have a really good answer to that question, nor do I know if I should definitely be opinionated on the Welsh public, given my friendly but outsider status.
Of course, no, we
Is that
totally
fair
understand
enough?
that. Yes, it's very fair. It's very fair. I feel the same because I do live in Wales, but I'm not Welsh, and it's a question that came through our project a lot, and we kind of want to talk with other people about it, especially from people from academia. It's it's the question of Wales being colonized, but also taking part in colonization. Is that dialogue that we find very interesting and very relevant. So yeah, that's mainly the purpose of that question, but we totally understand.
Yeah.
And we agree with.
Fair enough, Robert. And I think since you live in Wales, you do have a yeah. And I think if most people should feel that they're qualified to have a perspective. I'm just being a little bit uh, self-aware, I suppose,
Yeah.
as somebody in a relatively authoritative position as a historian, as an academic. I don't know if I'd want this necessarily if I'm part of the Welsh public, somebody telling me how to think about this. I don't know. What do you think, Hannah, since your hand is up?
I was sad we can widen that question to England or the UK in general about that gap between historical knowledge and public perception. If you think there's a gap, and if so, how can it be bridged?
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of years back, I was honored and fortunate enough to be invited to take part as an expert witness in the Belgian Parliament's attempt to reflect on its own colonial past, an investigation into its own colonial past, which took place in Parliament, was a really serious undertaking, ended in failure in effect, and in a sort of non-resolution with various politicians walking out and spoiling the vote, if you like, at the end. But was a serious attempt to reckon with the past from a parliamentary perspective. And one of my reflections on that experience, and indeed I made this reflection out loud as part of the parliamentary sitting that I was part of, was, at least they're trying. At least there's an attempt here, however botched and however difficult and flawed it was, and it was flawed in many ways, inevitably, I think. At least there's an attempt there. I don't think there's much of an attempt in England, in Britain, at this moment, really, to try to engage the public in a serious debate on the colonial or imperial past of Britain. Too much of it just gets immediately sucked down into sort of culture wars space and reason and intelligent debate, and the true sharing of ideas just kind of gets, it seems to me, lost or crowded out. So, and I suppose that when you sort of think, what does it look like? How does that debate really take place? Maybe a museum would be a good idea, an intellectual space for the British imperial past to be thought about. But we don't really have that. I mean, we have the International Slavery Museum, of course. There is there are initiatives for sort of a Black Cultural Archive online and those kind of things, but there isn't that central funded museum of imperial history, really, is there. And I think while we've got that kind of infrastructure lacking, that's symptomatic of a real, I suppose, gap between historical knowledge and public perception. Yeah, yeah. Having said that, I mean, lots of people do, you know, don't want to sound as if I'm sort of charging the public at large with being ignorant. I don't think that's the case at all. What I'm saying is I don't think there's the forum to bring public understanding to bear on, you know, historical research, historical knowledge.
Thank you, Robert.
That's great. You gave us a quote for our funders.
Yes,
Because you wanted to do an exhibition, so you literally gave us a quote for our funders.
Okay, good stuff. Yeah, yeah.
Amazing. Now we're just kind of exploring a question, connection between the Welsh Black communities and the Welsh working class. It can be in England as well. Maybe like white. In your work, how do you see connections between struggles of Black communities within Wales and the experience of Welsh working class communities during the same kind of periods?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Robert. Well, those of course aren't mutually separate categories, are they? The Welsh working class might itself be formed of Black communities, so there is potential and considerable overlap in those two categories. And when you think about the sort of sailor communities of Cardiff in the past, for instance, you can see that overlap quite clearly. But if it's all right, I'll answer the question by thinking specifically about the bit of this history that I know best, which is the African Institute, and just sort of share some interesting insights, I think, into that question when you look at it in terms of the 1890s, early 1900s, and what's happening in Colwyn Bay. One of the really interesting aspects of the history of the African Institute is that William Hughes does see this connection between the experience of the Welsh people and the experience of some of the West African societies whose young sons and daughters he's inviting to come over to Wales. He sees a connection in the shared experience under English exploitation and the sort of danger of cultural and linguistic loss through England. So he's making this point in speeches, and then that same point is sort of echoes also through some of the understandings of some of his West African interlocutors and other sort of intellectuals who are involved in the school at Colwyn Bay. We've got something in common here. It's not simply not a sort of common enemy so much, because I don't think Hughes sees England in those sort of terms, but we need to fight. We need to preserve our heritage, our culture, and our language, and not just simply see it all be lost to English imperialism. He sees that as beneficial to West Africa, that they maintain their own cultures and faiths, because he thinks that that's ultimately the best way in which the word of God will be spread through West Africa. So even there's a sort of, I suppose, broadly speaking, imperial idea. But he is making a case for sort of some level of cultural independence and autonomy and relativism separate from rising English influence, which of course is being felt both in Wales at that time and in West Africa. So that's there's I think, a really interesting coming together of how Black communities and Welsh communities could think about themselves and think about one another in a sort of comparative way.
That's a very beautiful example. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna, let's shift towards your current work, which we're very excited to find out more about. Obviously, share as much as you want, or like just it's considering your ongoing research project on Black people's role in local and national cultures at the heart of the British Empire. this is like a very important point in our project as well. We're trying to look for little known stories, especially when it comes to rural Wales, and how how Black communities navigated and also like influenced and brought a lot of culture within those communities. Yeah, anything you can say on this subject?
Yeah, thank you. So I am continuing my research in the late Victorian period, and I suppose, to put it broadly, the Black experience in Britain at that time. Still that same sort of sense that, you know, this is Victorian history, and I'm a Victorian scholar. So, but it's an undeveloped aspect of our understanding of the Victorian past. So, my current research is focused right in on one individual. So I was saying earlier that the African Institute is a bit of a microhistory. I've gone smaller in my current project and looking at an individual, but actually a very prolific individual. His name was S.J. Celestine Edwards, and he was a Barbadian man who came to Britain in his youth, actually, as a stowaway, and made his way around northern Britain in the 1880s before developing a bit of a reputation as a public speaker by the time of the early 1890s. And then takes up residence in London and becomes a bit of a small minor celebrity, speaking in Victoria Park in East London, open air speeches before hundreds or, you know, really large audiences, often of working class people, in fact. He's speaking predominantly about Christianity at that point. But he becomes well known, and he's often, and part of his Christianity and part of his Christian thinking does take him in the direction of thinking about empire and the exploitativeness of empire. And he's particularly concerned about the sale of liquor to Africa. He sees it as a sort of, in the same way that temperance reformers would often link questions of race with questions of Christianity. He sees it all as part of the same problem, the sort of a sinful world and a godless and an increasingly secular world. He becomes the first editor, we think the first Black editor of a British newspaper, which again is a sort of Christian newspaper, Christian evidence newspaper called Lux. And that's 1892, I think. And then within about 18 months, he's editing a second newspaper, which is called Fraternity, which is regarded today as, they didn't have the word anti-racism back then, of course, but it's sort of it's a paper which is sort of critical of the role of color prejudice in shaping global politics, I suppose. And becomes a sort of a mover and a shaker in that world as well. He's unfortunately really short-lived. He dies in 1894 while about 37, I think it is, overwork. He's out, lecturing, sometimes, several times a week, sometimes a few times a day, and editing two papers at the same time. And he burns himself out when he develops a lung complaint and really can't afford to stop the work. Doesn't have the sort of wealthy patronage which would enable perhaps other newspaper people at that time to pause, recover their health, go again. He has to keep working, unfortunately. So I've been looking at him and looking at some of his strategies in terms of bringing the message of what we today call anti-racism to the Victorian people, and thinking about how he managed to do that, because obviously late Victorian England's not a brilliant space in which to try to speak the language of anti-racism. It's a predominantly racist society, of course, although there are people who are, sympathetic to that cause, quite progressive in their thinking. So I've been looking at the various ways in which he tries to think about and connect questions of race prejudice and the violence of empire to other concerns that the Victorians more naturally shared, such as Christianity. He's really fascinating when it comes to his thinking about Darwin and Darwinism, for instance. He's lecturing in London in the 1890s on Darwin. It's just a terrific, interesting aspect to the history of Darwinism, among other things. He's talking about socialism, and all the time trying to connect it up to questions of race bigotry in an unjust world. So I suppose I'm trying to work with Edwards in trying to rethink the Victorians and to come to a slightly more nuanced understanding of the Victorian culture and society as being not simply racist, although it was and was predominantly that, but also in a sort of emergent sense, capable of thinking against that prejudice too. And that's the project that I'm doing at the moment.
Sounds fascinating.
So I said it's like a smaller project, yet it's not, in the sense that he edited two newspapers and wrote a lot for them as well, and one of them was a weekly newspaper. So that just means it's a lot of his own writing and his own work that we're able to recover. And I've also been able, using 19th century newspapers, to recover a sense of his prolificness out there as a public speaker as well. It's just incredible, this guy, traveling right around Britain. It's not just London. He gets himself way out beyond London. Sheffield, Newcastle, Liverpool, Manchester. He's out there. He's got, networks, talking in front of audiences. So there's something also in this history about, I suppose, provincial Britain beyond London. We sometimes, I think, imagine that those parts of this country may be less progressive. Maybe when the riots were happening, a year or so ago, there was that narrative out there as well. But there absolutely is a history also of progressive support for challenging slavery, challenging imperialism, challenging race prejudice in Britain's more northern towns and cities, and can remind us also that, as well as the riots being a sort of about a racist backlash, they also produced, didn't they, a whole load of sort of anti-racism campaigning too. We need to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. We found that as well in Swansea. Was like a huge anti-racist, anti-apartheid movement.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, it was the anti-racism marches were always bigger.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a very interesting point. Was he even ever in Wales? You think?
Was he in Wales?
Yeah, ever.
Do you know what? Really frustratingly for me and for you guys as well, I don't think he was particularly. It's also frustrating for an academic who's based in Leeds. He went to Huddersfield, he went to Sheffield, and he even says in one of his letters, next year I'll get to Leeds, but it's because his unexpected, death. He doesn't get as far as he'd have liked to have done. So no, unfortunately, he does make it up into Scotland, and actually is in Aberdeen. So goes quite far north in Scotland and everything. But as I sit here now, I can't recall him making any forays to Wales. Probably on his list of things to do.
Probably. Yeah, that is a shame, especially for Leeds, especially since you're based and work there.
Yeah, I know.
Amazing. So yeah, towards the end, we're just gonna do some like reflection on future and the future of Welsh colonial history. If you could encourage a shift if you could encourage one shift in how we talk about Wales and its colonial history, what would that be? This can also translate to like the wide UK, realizing that you're not based in Wales, obviously. Sorry for.
No, that's fine. Yeah. But I think some of the issues probably which exist for Wales probably exist for Britain at large as well. This is partly going to be me repeating myself in some of my earlier answers somewhat, but I think that's okay, and maybe it brings those into focus. The great potential for sort of Black historical research, as I see it in this country, is about people coming together And I said earlier that a lot of the great work that's happening at the moment is led by communities and activist researchers. Those groups, I think, often understandably have some issues of trust regarding people like me, academic researchers who I think can too often parachute in and do the research and kind of leave again. And I think that is a real phenomenon. I also think it's tricky because as an academic researcher, you want to be able to really understand your topic and come and bring some expertise to the community that you want to work with. So that might mean that you do go off and do your reading first, if that makes sense. But there needs to be ways to come together and for I think for academia to increasingly to find ways to support, and I mean sort of materially to support the really important work which is happening through communities, through libraries, through archives, museums, and so on. And I think that's, I mean, it's not completely distinctive because other forms of history are doing that as well, but it is something which can really define what Black British historical research can and should look like. It shouldn't be left in the ivory tower of academia. You know, it makes no sense there really. And it would just be so much lesser and weaker were it confined to that space. The other thing I would sort of say in terms of ways forward, and this is just a sort of personal feeling, I suppose, about Black historical research in Britain. I think it'd be really interesting for that field to take stock of its methods. And I suppose I've just been saying that really in terms of how it goes about the task of recovering the past. And I think that is partly about its sort of ethics and its practices and about how it can bring people together. And that's part of what I mean by methods. But I think also it would be really good for that field of research to come together and sort of think about how we're acquiring a knowledge base. What archives are we using? How do we search them? You know, some real basic questions like that. What are the sort of do's and don'ts of approaching Black British or Welsh past? What are the sort of trappings? Why do we keep sort of finding ourselves going back over certain subjects and continuing to ignore or to have other ones somewhat evade us? You know, I think a lot of this comes down to funding, essentially, into whether academia is willing truly to back and support research in this field, because all of this work takes time and so money. But yeah, so it sounds a bit dry, but sort of thinking a bit about that question of how, not just what we're covering, but how we go about our research of Black Welsh history, I think would be a really interesting set of conversations for the field to be having.
Amazingly said. Thank you. And last question. What advice would you give to educators, students, or community members who want to engage more deeply with Black history?
Yeah. Sorry if this sounds repetitive. I feel like I've already said it possibly, but it is about, I think, you know, coming together. There is loads of great research happening at the moment. We are in a very different place to where we were 10, 20 years ago. And one of the things that is really exciting is when people come together and break down those boundaries that perhaps in theory exist between those different categories that you just identified, Robert, there, you know, students, researchers, community, and so on. Dialogues across those theoretical divides, I think, are really valuable. So that would be my kind of hope for the field, really, that it can work through a dialogue to shed yet new light on the past. And I think that does mean, you know, going to the archive and finding out things that happened in the past that we were previously unfamiliar with, or which we now want to see differently. But I think it's that latter point that partly this is about contemporary perspectives and about shifting our present day perspectives on the past, not just about simply going off and finding more and more information, but reinterpreting it in light of, a changing and more diverse young population in Britain.
Thank you, Robert. That's amazing. Anna, do you have anything else to add while we have Rob here?
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much for your time. That's been so insightful. I can feel like I've learned a lot, definitely, from hearing you speak, and it's given us so much to take back and further our research and our work. I think, let me look through my notes. I think something that really stuck out to me was this like central idea of the importance of community and coming together. But I think now more than ever, that's something that we're really struggling with, especially in light of COVID and us still recovering and the recent riots. So I wanted to ask, perhaps if you could, not necessarily if you have an answer, I don't think anybody has an answer, but perhaps some advice on really how we can come together, how we can bring about community when sometimes people feel they're at odds.
Yeah, sure. And I suppose when I was thinking about community in some of my previous answers, I was kind of thinking about communities of like minds in a way and communities of researchers. And so perhaps I'm not quite answering your question if you're truly asking, how do you bring a perhaps divided or perhaps isolated community together? I think that's really hard. But perhaps first steps are around that community of researchers with the interest in this subject and broadening that and making sure that it can remain healthy. And as I say, I don't think that's really hard because time and funding are the issues there. So then it kind of passes over to, funding bodies, institutions who do have access to material support to be able to pass that on and to enable those communities to really do what they do so well. So yeah, I don't think I have a really coherent answer to it, Hannah.
No,
But
yeah.
but it's about, I think it's about building outward, isn't it, from what links you have, and where we know the connections exist, then let's really keep them strong and tap into one another's knowledge and expertise. I think that's what your project is doing really well. And you've reached out to one academic, and I imagine you're kind of reaching out to others as part of the project. No academic's ever going to mind receiving an email from you to talk about this kind of stuff. It's what we do actually, and it kind of it helps us probably feel a bit more grounded and authentic, and fundamentally we want to be able to further the work that you're doing. So those connections between academia and as a source of potential support and expertise, and then the kind of projects that you're involved in, I think is a part of the picture here that I'd want you to never feel shy in trying to strengthen, work on, but it is only part of it, actually. And I'm kind of almost dodging the really hard question is how do you go out beyond those like minds into other communities, across generational divides, perhaps, who knows, and really bridge and find the shared ground there, and to understand how, as I said earlier in the interview, these histories, they're all our histories. But there is an awful lot of goodwill, tolerance, and understanding out there, isn't there? Even as at the same time, it can often feel as if we're becoming increasingly divided and isolated from one another.
Thank you so much for your time. That's been amazing. Let me end the recording now, unless Robert.
No, it's
I
good.
both. If you have any questions, Robert, Dr. Robert, please let us know, or if Robert or us has anything they want to say.
No, like thank you. Yeah, thank you for what you said. It's yeah, very very amazingly put, and yeah, and thank you for giving us confidence to reach out to even more academia. Yeah, we needed that. That's a good reason.